They are put out there to shape information operations, to shape perceptions, but there's very little reality to them. As far as the Russians in the field go, I think they know they're not really advancing and that they can't really do this. And indeed, some of the commanders there, I think, have um, what's the right expression there? I think they figured out the game that instead of actually succeeding at taking the objective at extraordinarily high cost, they can go through the motions of attacking the objective. They lose a lot of people, but the commanders get paid off as they do this. And so they're actually very interested in the battle continuing rather than in the victory.
From European perspective, in looking at it, Katja Kallas, on behalf of the European leaders, turned around and said that the Russians were asking for everything, but in the plan that was being produced, there seemed to be no concessions from the Russians at all. Do you think we'll ever see any concessions from the Russians?
No, I don't. I think what we're going to see in the end is an end to fighting. I don't think Russia or Putin will give up on any of their objectives. They will have all of these demands of Ukraine and all these demands of the West, and no action, no responsibility, no concessions on their part at all. But if we can get to a point where they stop attacking and we just have a ceasefire in place, I think everybody can live with that. We then deepen it, we make it last longer, we create deterrence against future attacks, we help Ukraine get on with being a sovereign, independent state again. That's where I think we'll end up.
But Zelensky proposed a similar sort of plan before Donald Trump got inaugurated. You know, he came out and said he recognized that Ukraine could not take the territory that Russia had already captured back by force, and therefore, you know, he would be content with parking it to be dealt with diplomatically at some stage in the future. Do you think the Russians will ever accept something like that?
Well, accept is a tricky word, because on the one hand, I can see them doing it, and on the other hand, I can see them saying that they don't accept it, that it's not good enough. They want more. But I could see them in practice having a ceasefire.
One of the things that came out with ceasefire and all the rest of it, and this is what I had forgotten, is that there's the security guarantees that come in. And yeah, again, part of the 28-point plan, we don't know if it's made into the 19-point, was the US providing an Article 5 type guarantee to Ukraine. But surely we had that under the Budapest Memorandum, where, you know, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia had said that they were going to provide security guarantees to Ukraine. How do we convince the Ukrainians that any paper guarantees are actually going to be lived up to this time?
Yeah. So very good question. So the security guarantee in Europe that everyone knows, understands, and actually works is NATO. We have Article 5, and an attack on one is considered to be an attack on all, and everybody responds. And this has deterred aggression against NATO for 75 years. That is the bottom line. That's the baseline. If you then say, okay, we're not going to let them into NATO, but we will provide security guarantees, you're immediately saying it's less than NATO. And the Budapest Memorandum is a good example. It was far less than NATO, and turned out there was no backup at all. It was words on a page that no one actually lived up to. It was not a treaty obligation. There was no structure. There was no decision-making body. There was no military backup behind it. There was no positioning of forces, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you need something less than NATO, I guess, but more than the Budapest Memorandum. So here is what countries are then talking about. Well, we can have a coalition of the willing force deployed inside Ukraine. We can do training and equipping of the Ukrainian military. We can share intelligence. We can help Ukrainians with air defenses. And so you start adding on and on. Still get to the question, well, what if Russia ignores all that and attacks anyway? What do you do? And if the answer is nothing, then there's no security guarantee. So we have to keep working on that. In the 28-point plan that Witkoff produced, there's nothing in there about security guarantees. They were referred to as if they exist, but there was no description of what they are. So that was kind of absent. I don't know, none of us know what's in the 19-point plan that Rubio has worked out with Ukrainians and Europeans. Presumably, there's a bit more on security guarantees there.
Well, it's interesting. The Ukrainians are saying that bar a little bit of work, they could potentially come out and support it. But do you think part of the rationale behind why this plan suddenly appeared was down to the threat of potential supply of Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine, the increased support that Donald Trump was beginning to give to Ukraine from a military perspective, and Vladimir Putin genuinely getting worried about how the war is going for him?
Yes, but let's take those in a few pieces if we can, Philip, because starting with Putin being worried, yes, he has economic problems, high inflation, high interest rates. He can't get the components that he needs, gasoline shortages because of attacks on refineries, some of which have been at long range. The Ukrainians have done with their own capabilities. Uh, so all of these things he knows. Also, his military is not succeeding in Ukraine. He's losing thousands and thousands of people in military equipment and not gaining anything. And he knows that. So I think he does want to see, can he push harder and harder to get an end to the war delivered to him on terms that he wants. And that's why he's escalated his attacks on cities and the energy infrastructure right ahead of the winter to try to create a sense of greater urgency that Ukraine needs an end to the fighting. But it's because Russia is in a weak position that he's doing this. So that's that part. Now, as to this particular plan, I think we have to look at the diplomatic sequence here that took place. Zelensky was going to Washington. There was talk of tomahawks, but the U.S. was saying, not now. This is a threat, but we're not going to do it now. Putin calls and throws off the meeting between Zelensky and Trump on the Friday and promises to have a summit meeting with Trump in Budapest. And then, of course, Trump, having been fooled once by Witkoff to doing the Alaska summit, puts Rubio in charge of preparing the Budapest summit. Rubio talks with Lavrov, who says, no, we're not changing our position at all. We want everything still just like in Alaska, no change. So Rubio understands what he has heard from Lavrov and reports that, and the meeting gets called off. Well, once that meeting's called off, the Russians send Kirill Dmitriev to Florida to meet with Witkoff, avoiding Rubio, to get the position into Witkoff. Here's what we want as the Russians. And of course, Witkoff doesn't push back on that, just grabs it, turns it into a plan, and puts it out.
Sounds like a good soap opera. Maybe this is going to turn into a Netflix drama at some stage if it wasn't so serious and people suffering on the ground.
If they do it, I hope they do it like the death of Stalin, because as dark as it is also so ridiculous that it can be funny.
But it's a perfect example of how international geopolitics works. But the other thing that seems to be changing the minute is what's going on in the information domain. And Russia's putting out an awful lot of commentary about them being tactically successful around Pokrovsk and elsewhere on the front line, and clearly putting statements out that are untrue. Do you think that's another indication that Putin or Putin's forces are worried about what's going to come this winter?
Well, first off, they've been tactically successful for 2 years and never strategically successful. So you have to wonder what those tactical successes really amount to, if anything. They are put out there to shape information operations, to shape perceptions, but there's very little reality to them. As far as the Russians in the field go, I think they know they're not really advancing and that they can't really do this. And indeed, some of the commanders there, I think, have, what's the right expression there? I think they figured out the game, that instead of actually succeeding at taking the objective at extraordinarily high cost, they can go through the motions of attacking the objective. They lose a lot of people, but the commanders get paid off as they do this. And so they're actually very interested in the battle continuing rather than in the victory.
Can Putin afford not to have a war now?
That's a very good question, because he has transformed the Russian economy to be on a completely war footing. So they don't have the civilian jobs and civilian capacity that you would need in a normal economy. He doesn't want all of these soldiers coming home. They are now poor, battle hardened, angry, drugged, and alcoholic, and probably incapable of fitting into society. So he probably doesn't want them to come back. And because his adventure in Ukraine has been a failure, if it's really over, then everyone will see this was just a big mistake, a big failure. Whereas as long as it continues to go on, he can justify that, he's succeeding, he's winning, we have to keep fighting.
So you're an ambassador. You're there to give advice as to what's going to happen next, not just explain what's happening now. What are we going to see through the rest of this year and through 2026, do you think?
Yeah. I think the thing to do is just keep an eye on the fundamentals. The fundamentals here are that Ukraine is getting support from the US and Europe, and our economy is 22 times the size of Russia's economy. Our military forces are far more capable than the Russian military forces. We have better technology. We have equipment that actually works. The Ukrainians are there on the ground and they are fighting, and they're going to continue to fight. So Ukraine doesn't lose here. Ukraine survives as a sovereign, independent European democracy. Russia, on the other hand, is by itself. They're relying on North Korean artillery and occasionally troops, Iranian drones. They're lacking components and they need to buy them from China. Their finances are in terrible shape. And if oil prices stay down, and if we put in place more and more sanctions, secondary sanctions on the oil and gas trade, I think Russia's going to find itself in a difficult position. I would predict that at some point next year, I was hoping it would be this year, but I don't see it anymore. But hopefully next year, Russia will get to the point where it needs a ceasefire. And then we will not have a peace deal. We will have no agreement with Russia at all. It'll simply be an end to fighting. And that should be enough. And we have to lean in at that stage to prop up and strengthen Ukraine, strengthen their military, get them on track with the EU, deploy a coalition of the willing, and deter future Russian attacks against the parts of Ukraine that Ukraine still controls. That, I think, is where we end up. And then we'll have a long-term dispute with Russia, just as we did about the Baltic states for 40 years, or as we did about Eastern Germany for 40 years.
And therefore, we will have a military commitment helping Ukraine and propping it up for decades, potentially.
Indefinitely. There's no end point to NATO. There's no expiry date. Similarly, there shouldn't be an expiration date on security guarantees for Ukraine. And ultimately, I think if that's the situation we end up in, future governments in the US and Western Europe are going to ask themselves, why are we committed to security for Ukraine in the same way we are to everybody else in NATO, but they're not in NATO? Why don't we just make it NATO? But that's not going to happen under President Trump.
Well, that's very interesting and in a way very sad that we're not going to see a proper end to the conflict. There's a positive that comes out of it, though. That gives me plenty of excuses to invite you back onto Times Radio Frontline. Ambassador Kurt Volker, it's been a real pleasure talking to you today.
My pleasure talking with you, Philip. Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.